The quiet melody, twilight, a bruised purple, bled through the single window of Leo's small apartment, stirring dust motes into an ancient, silent ballet. He sat in his perpetually flattened armchair, fingers tracing the fretboard of his acoustic guitar. A quiet lament, a tender ache given form, flowed from the strings, a melody born of solitude, of evenings spent watching city lights flicker into distant, unattainable stars. The notes, fragile as spun glass, hung in the air. He wasn't playing for an audience, but for the quiet corners of his soul, for unspoken thoughts too heavy to bear alone. His apartment was a testament to an intentionally lived life. Books lined shelves crafted from salvaged planks, their spines a kaleidoscope of forgotten adventures. A half-finished canvas depicting a storm-tossed sea leaned against a wall, its hues mirroring the melancholy in his music. Yet the guitar, an old Gibson with a rich, warm tone, was the room's undeniable heart. More than an instrument, it was a confidant, a keeper of secrets, a voice for words he often struggled to articulate. The final chord dissolved into the deepening twilight, followed by a soft, almost inaudible sigh. The ensuing silence felt vast. He carefully returned the guitar to its stand, then reached for the soft, lint-free cloth he kept exclusively for its care. With meticulous strokes, he polished the rosewood body, tracing the grain, feeling the cool, smooth wood beneath his fingertips. Each swirl was a gesture of affection, a silent promise of continued devotion. His thumb brushed a small, barely perceptible scratch near the sound hole, a battle scar from a forgotten coffee shop performance years ago. The guitar had been a steadfast companion through lean times and quiet triumphs, a presence that understood him in a way few others ever had. His gaze swept the room. The air was still, faintly scented with old paper and brewing tea. He savored these moments of undisturbed peace, these pockets of time when the external world receded, leaving him to his thoughts and the instrument's resonant hum. It was in these hours he felt most truly himself, unburdened by social complexities or feigned interest. Just Leo, a man, and his music, adrift in the quiet current of his own making. Just as he prepared to tuck the polishing cloth away, a sharp, insistent rap echoed through the small apartment, a sound rarely heard in his evenings. His hand hovered over the guitar's headstock, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Who would call at this hour? His social circle was modest, impromptu visits unheard of. Mrs. Henderson, his landlord, texted. Friends called first. Another knock, louder this time, followed by an impatient clearing of a throat. The sudden intrusion struck a discordant note in his carefully composed evening. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He expected no one. He was prepared for no one. With a hesitant breath, he set the cloth down and slowly rose, his movements a little stiff. His heart, usually a quiet rhythm, began a faster, more anxious tempo. He walked towards the door, footsteps soft on the bare wooden floor, each step a question mark. Who could it be? What could they possibly want? He reached the door, hand hovering over the cold metal of the doorknob. Another deep breath, steeling himself. The quiet melody of his evening had been abruptly interrupted, and he suspected a simple return to silence wasn't in store. He opened the door a crack, peering through the narrow gap. A tall, unfamiliar figure stood on his landing, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. The man leaned confidently, almost casually against the doorframe, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Leo's breath hitched. This was definitely not Mrs. Henderson, or any friend he knew. "Leo?" the man asked, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that seemed to fill the small space. "Ryan." From down the hall. Leo's mind raced. Ryan, the new tenant. He'd glimpsed him once, maybe twice, in the communal hallway, but they hadn't spoken. Not a word. The initial surprise gave way to a fresh wave of apprehension. What could Ryan possibly want? And why now, when the world outside had finally settled into its nocturnal rhythm? The quiet melody of his evening had been irrevocably altered. A burst of sound, a sharp, insistent rapping on the apartment door shattered the afternoon's fragile peace. Leo, lost in the intricate dance of his fingers across the fretboard, flinched, a sour note jarring the melody he'd been coaxing from his vintage acoustic. He rarely had visitors. His world was quiet, a sanctuary built around the warm hum of tubes and the resonant thrum of strings. The knocking came again, louder this time, demanding attention. He laid his guitar carefully on the plush rug, the half-finished chord still echoing in the silence, and moved towards the door with a frown of apprehension. Through the peephole, a kaleidoscope of bright colors and an undeniably handsome face filled the tiny lens. A stranger, or rather the new tenant from down the hall, Ryan. Leo had only glimpsed him a few times. A flash of a vibrant shirt, a cascade of dark hair, a laugh that seemed to echo through the entire building. Ryan was the kind of person who seemed to consume all the air in a room, even from a distance. Leo opened the door a crack, his hand hovering over the chain lock. "Can I help you?" His voice was a little rougher than he intended. Ryan's grin was immediate and disarming, a flash of white teeth against sun-kissed skin. He leaned against the doorframe as if he owned it, radiating an almost aggressive confidence. "Hey, neighbor. Ryan. From 3B. Look, I'm in a bit of a bind, a massive, catastrophic bind, actually." His voice was a rich baritone, imbued with a theatrical urgency that made Leo's eyebrows rise. "My guitar. Totally trashed. Snapped neck. Don't ask. And I've got a gig tonight. A big one. Like career-defining big." He gestured vaguely with a hand that wore several silver rings catching the light. I heard you play. Sounds like you've got some serious hardware in here." His gaze swept past Leo, an unspoken question in his bright, inquisitive eyes. Leo's grip on the doorframe tightened. Hardware. He had hardware. Beautiful, cherished pieces of wood and wire that were extensions of his soul. The thought of lending one to a man he barely knew, a whirlwind of a person who spoke in hyperbole, sent a shiver of protectiveness through him. "I don't really lend out my instruments," Leo said, his voice flat, trying to convey a polite but firm refusal. Ryan's smile didn't falter, but a hint of something earnest, almost pleading, entered his eyes. "Please, man, this isn't some open mic night at a dive bar. This is a chance to play on a real stage, in front of a real crowd. My band, the Nocturnes. We've been working towards this for months, and now, this." He ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed, though the distress was perfectly framed, almost performative. "I just need something decent, something with a good sound. I promise I'll be careful, like obsessive-compulsive careful." Leo's gaze drifted to the corner of his living room where his prized possession rested on its stand. A pre-war Gibson, its cherry sunburst finish gleaming softly, a guitar whose voice was as warm and soulful as an old friend's embrace. He'd inherited it from his grandfather, a musician himself, and it was more than just an instrument. It was a legacy. He could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Lending it out was unthinkable, reckless. But Ryan's eyes held a genuine spark of desperation, a fellow musician's plea that resonated deep within Leo, despite his reservations. The guy had a gig. He needed a guitar. What if it were him? He sighed, the sound escaping him before he could suppress it. "I have a few, options," he conceded, pushing the door open wider, a sense of resignation settling over him. He knew, even as he said the words, that he was going to do it. The unexpectedness of it all, the sudden intrusion into his quiet world, was disorienting. A part of him, a small, adventurous part he rarely indulged, felt a flicker of something akin to excitement. This was certainly not boring. Ryan's face lit up, a full-beam smile that made the room feel brighter. Seriously, you're a lifesaver, man, a legend. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small space, bringing with him the scent of something spicy and clean, like fresh air and a distant bonfire. His eyes immediately landed on the Gibson. Whoa, is that... He approached it reverently, his usual boisterous energy momentarily subdued. He reached out, his fingers hovering above the polished wood as if afraid to touch it. She's beautiful. Leo watched him, a strange mix of dread and a reluctant admiration warring within him. He was lending his soul to a stranger, a charismatic enigma who had burst into his life like a sudden, dazzling chord. "Be careful," Leo warned, his voice soft, almost a plea. "She's special." Ryan met his gaze, his expression serious for the first time. "I know," he said, and for a fleeting moment, Leo believed him. "I promise." Ryan picked up the guitar, handling it with surprising tenderness, and strummed a single, resonant chord. The sound filled Leo's apartment, warm and rich, a burst of sound that promised change, disruption, and perhaps something new. The unreturned tune. The silence in Leo's apartment stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. 3 days, then 4. The dread that had initially prickled at the edges of his anticipation had solidified into a dull ache. He imagined his Gibson, a beautiful sunburst, languishing in some smoky dive bar, or worse, pawned for a quick buck. He'd known it was a mistake, a moment of weakness fueled by Ryan's persuasive charm and that undeniable spark of shared musical passion. He'd even practiced a few scathing lines in his head, ready for the inevitable confrontation when Ryan finally, if ever, materialized with the guitar. By the end of the first week, Leo had cycled through anger, resignation, and a perverse sense of relief that at least he wouldn't have to navigate the awkwardness of another encounter with Ryan. He spent his evenings on his old acoustic, the sound thin and reedy compared to the rich resonance of his electric. He tried to write, but the melodies felt hollow, echoing the emptiness where his favorite instrument should have been. The unreturned tune, he thought bitterly, was his own, a song left unfinished because the right instrument was gone. Then, on a Tuesday evening, just as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, a sharp, insistent knock rattled his apartment door. Leo froze, his hand hovering over the fretboard of his acoustic. It couldn't be. He hadn't heard from Ryan, no texts, no calls, no smoke signals. Slowly he rose, his heart thumping an erratic rhythm against his ribs. He peered through the peephole. Ryan stood there, a lopsided grin splitting his face, and slung across his back, nestled in its worn leather case, was Leo's Gibson. Relief washed over Leo so intensely it nearly buckled his knees. But before he could even register the return, Ryan was already speaking, his voice a low rumble. "Hey, Leo. So, the gig went great. Better than great, actually. But, I was thinking, I wrote this new riff, and it needs something only your Gibson can give it. And, well, I was hoping you wouldn't mind if we tried it out together." He gestured vaguely with his free hand, his eyes bright with an almost childlike enthusiasm. Leo stared, mouth slightly agape. He had envisioned a sheepish return, maybe an apology, certainly not this audacious proposition. The nerve of the man. Yet a strange excitement, like a forgotten melody suddenly surfacing, began to bubble up inside him. The anger, the dread, it all evaporated in the face of Ryan's sheer, unadulterated passion. He opened the door wider. "You want to play now?" he asked, a hint of incredulity in his voice. Ryan's grin widened. "Why not? The inspiration's hitting me hard. Plus, I figured it'd be a good excuse to actually return the guitar, officially. He winked, and Leo felt a blush creep up his neck. Minutes later, the apartment was transformed. Ryan had unpacked the Gibson, its sunburst finish gleaming under the soft lamplight. Leo, still slightly disoriented, had retrieved his own electric, a sleek black Telecaster he rarely played. Ryan settled onto the threadbare rug, Leo on the edge of his old armchair. Okay, so it's got this kind of bluesy, almost defiant feel, Ryan explained, strumming a series of sharp, staccato chords. The Gibson sang, its tone rich and full, a sound Leo had sorely missed. Leo listened, his fingers twitching instinctively. He picked up his Telecaster, feeling the familiar weight in his hands, and began to improvise, weaving a counter-melody around Ryan's progression. It was tentative at first, a shy exploration, but as Ryan's playing grew more confident, more complex, Leo found himself rising to the challenge. He layered a smooth, sustained note over Ryan's rhythmic pulse, then added a quick, intricate run, a question posed in sound. Ryan's head snapped up, a look of pure delight on his face. "Yeah, that's it. Keep that going," he urged, his eyes sparkling. They played for what felt like hours, the air thick with the hum of amplifiers and the vibrant collision of their instruments. Ryan would lay down a solid bass line, full of unexpected syncopations, and Leo would find a way to dance around it. Sometimes mirroring, sometimes contrasting, always complementing. They didn't speak much, the music doing all the talking. There were moments when their melodies intertwined so perfectly, so effortlessly, that Leo felt a shiver run down his spine, a sensation of being utterly in tune with another person. It was a language he understood, a dialogue he had yearned for but never truly found. As the last chords faded into the quiet hum of the room, Ryan leaned back, a contented sigh escaping his lips. "Man, that was something else," he murmured, his gaze fixed on Leo. "We should do this again, soon." Leo, still tingling from the musical high, could only nod, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. The unreturned tune, it seemed, had finally found its harmony. Late-night harmonies, the scent of old wood and new strings filled Leo's small living room as the music nights became a regular, cherished ritual. Ryan, true to his word, had brought the Gibson back, but his visits didn't end there. Instead, the guitar became an excuse, a bridge to their late-night sessions. The initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by an easy rhythm of shared melodies and murmured harmonies. Ryan's fingers, surprisingly nimble despite their size, danced across the frets, coaxing intricate blues riffs from Leo's instrument, while Leo himself found a new freedom in his own playing, a responsiveness he hadn't felt in years. Aunt Clara, ever the silent observer, would often leave a plate of warm, still steaming oatmeal cookies on the coffee table before retreating to her room. The subtle click of her bedroom door was their cue that the evening had officially stretched into night. Under the soft golden glow of the single-floor lamp, its light pooling around their guitars like a protective aura, their conversations deepened. "You know," Ryan said one evening, strumming a slow, contemplative chord, "I always thought music was just a way to show off, to impress people." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the quiet room. "But playing with you, it's different. It's like finding a secret language." Leo, his gaze fixed on the intricate grain of his guitar, felt a warmth spread through him. "It's always been that for me," he admitted, his voice a little rough with emotion. "A way to say things I can't otherwise." He looked up, meeting Ryan's eyes. "What kind of things do you usually try to say?" Ryan paused, his fingers stilling on the strings. "I guess that I'm okay, that I've got it all figured out." He sighed, a soft expulsion of air, which, you know, is a complete lie most of the time. He leaned back against the worn cushions of the sofa, the guitar resting comfortably against his chest. I always had this idea of who I was supposed to be. The charming one, the confident one, the one who never doubts anything. Leo listened, truly listened, recognizing the subtle crack in Ryan's usually unflappable exterior. He saw past the dazzling smile and the easy swagger, glimpsing the earnestness beneath. "And what do you want to be?" Leo asked, his voice gentle. Ryan's eyes, usually so bright and commanding, softened. "Honestly, I just want to make something beautiful, something that lasts, something real." He looked at Leo, a hint of vulnerability in his gaze. "Like what we make together." That night they talked for hours, the music receding into the background as their stories unfolded. Ryan spoke of a childhood spent trying to live up to a successful father, of the pressure to excel, of the loneliness that sometimes accompanied his outward popularity. Leo, in turn, shared snippets of his own life, the solace he found in his music after his parents' divorce, the quiet joy of discovering a new chord progression, the fear of never truly connecting with another soul. Leo found himself captivated by Ryan's honesty, a stark contrast to the polished facade he presented to the world. He saw a deep well of kindness and a sharp, intuitive intelligence he hadn't initially perceived. Ryan, for his part, seemed to appreciate Leo's quiet wisdom and the gentle strength that emanated from him. He watched Leo's hands as they moved across the fretboard, precise and expressive, and listened to his insights, always thoughtful, never rushed. One evening, as the moon cast long shadows across the living room floor, Ryan confessed a dream he'd kept hidden for years. To write a song that truly moved people, not just one that topped the charts. Something soulful, he mused, plucking a melancholic arpeggio. Something that tells a story, not just a jingle. Leo felt a surge of connection. "We could do that," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "Together." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes widening slightly. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, lighting up the dim room more effectively than the lamp. "Yeah," he breathed. "Yeah, I think we could." The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities, a promise as sweet and complex as the harmonies they'd just created. The night deepened, but neither of them felt the passage of time, lost in the quiet unfolding of their shared world. A confusing melody. The scent of old wood and simmering tea had become a familiar comfort to Ryan. His visits to Leo's small apartment were now a regular occurrence, the initial awkwardness having long since dissipated, replaced by an easy rhythm. He'd arrive, guitar case in hand, Leo's guitar, which he still hadn't quite managed to return, and the hours would melt away in a blur of strummed chords and shared silences. Lately, though, a new sensation had begun to bloom within him whenever Leo was near. It was a soft, almost imperceptible warmth, like a sunbeam finding its way through a winter window, settling deep in his chest. A fuzzy, pleasant feeling that he couldn't quite categorize or explain. He'd catch himself prolonging their goodbyes. "Just one more run-through of that bridge," he'd suggest, even when the bridge was perfect. Or, "I should probably take this guitar home, but I really need to nail that arpeggio sequence before I forget it." Leo would just nod, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips, and Ryan would feel that internal warmth spread, a subtle current flowing between them. He found himself fabricating increasingly elaborate reasons to keep the instrument, and by extension, to keep returning. The truth was, he simply didn't want to leave. The air in Leo's apartment, infused with the subtle hum of creativity and something else he couldn't name, felt safer, more authentic than anywhere else. One afternoon, as Leo was demonstrating a particularly intricate finger-picking pattern, his fingers dancing across the fretboard with a newfound fluidity, Ryan felt a sudden urge to confide in him. "You know," he started, his voice a little rougher than he intended, "I used to think music was just a thing, a skill to master, a way to impress, but with you, it feels different." He paused, searching for the right words, a vulnerability he rarely displayed bubbling to the surface. "It feels like a language, a way to say things I can't otherwise." He looked at Leo, whose gaze was steady and unwavering, a silent invitation to continue. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be what everyone expected, the confident guy, the one who has it all figured out. But there's always been this ache, this desire to make something truly beautiful, something soulful, something that actually means something." He took a deep breath, the admission hanging in the air. "I have this secret dream, you know, to write music that resonates, that touches people deeply." He looked down at the guitar in his lap, the polished wood suddenly feeling heavy. "I never thought I'd tell anyone that." Leo didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes shining with an unexpected intensity. He just reached out and gently tapped Ryan's knee. "I understand," he said, his voice soft but firm. "More than you know." In that instant, a surge of possibility coursed through Ryan. It was as if a long-locked door had creaked open, revealing a path he hadn't dared to imagine. The fuzzy warmth in his chest intensified, blossoming into something akin to hope. Aunt Clara, who had been quietly tending to a pot of tea in the kitchen, emerged with a plate of freshly baked almond cookies. The aroma of warm sugar and nuts filled the air, a gentle signal that several hours had passed without them noticing. She placed the plate on the coffee table between them, her gaze lingering on Ryan for a beat longer than usual. A faint smile touched her lips as she caught Leo's eye, a silent, knowing acknowledgement passing between them. Ryan, oblivious to the subtle exchange, reached for a cookie. The sweetness, a comforting counterpoint to the rush of new, confusing emotions swirling within him. He found himself wondering if this feeling, this confusing melody playing in his heart, was what people meant by connection, and more importantly, if he wanted it to stop. The unspoken chord. The late hour had leached the last vestiges of color from the sky, leaving behind a velvety expanse pricked by the sharp, cold gleam of distant stars. Inside Leo's apartment, a lone, low-wattage lamp cast long, sinuous shadows that seemed to undulate with the cadence of their conversation. The air, redolent with the scent of aged paper and freshly brewed tea, thrummed with unspoken energy. Ryan, splayed on the well-worn rug, a half-empty mug nestled beside him, had been recounting a melody that had taken root in his mind, a delicate wisp of notes that refused to coalesce. It's almost there, you know," Ryan mused, his voice a low thrum. "But then it just dissolves, like a fleeting vision you can't quite grasp." He gestured vaguely, his hand brushing against Leo's knee where Leo sat cross-legged on the floor, his own mug cradled in his palms. The contact was ephemeral, barely perceptible, yet it sent a shiver through Ryan, a subtle jolt that resonated deep within him. Leo's gaze, typically so reserved, was unguarded and soft in the dim glow. "Perhaps it's not meant to resolve," he offered gently, his voice a quiet counterpoint to Ryan's fervor. "Perhaps its beauty lies in the lingering tension, the anticipation." Ryan's eyes fixed on him, truly seeing him, and in that instant the world beyond their small circle of lamplight seemed to recede into irrelevance. Leo's eyes, usually a deep, inscrutable brown, shimmered with an understanding that felt profound, almost sacred. A wave of something hot and unfamiliar unfurled in Ryan's chest. an urgent need to dismantle every barrier he'd ever erected. Words gathered on his tongue, a fragile confession poised to spill. He longed to tell Leo how his very presence had become the missing chord in his own life's symphony, how the quiet resonance of his being vibrated with a frequency Ryan hadn't known he craved. He yearned to confess the way his heart performed a small acrobat's flip when Leo smiled, how his days felt truncated without their nocturnal discussions, how Leo's gentle hand on his shoulder felt like the embrace of home. He parted his lips, the words a raw ache. "Leo, But then a cold dread coiled around his throat, constricting his breath. The sheer audacity of his feelings, the monumental upheaval they portended, struck him with the force of a tidal wave. This was Leo, his confidant, his musical compatriot, the quiet ballast in his increasingly turbulent existence. What if he was mistaken? What if he'd misinterpreted every subtle glance, every shared laugh? What if this new, terrifying vulnerability shattered the delicate equilibrium they had so painstakingly constructed? The specter of rejection, of misunderstanding, of irrevocably altering everything was a suffocating weight. His eyes darted away from Leo's expectant gaze, landing on a forgotten guitar pick on the rug. The moment, charged with a fragile electricity, fractured. I think I figured out the bridge for that song we were working on," he blurted, the words clunky and forced, a desperate attempt to divert the current of conversation, to escape the precipice he'd been teetering on. "The one with the minor seventh? I think a descending chromatic line would really hit." Leo's expression, which had softened into something akin to quiet anticipation, subtly shuddered. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a fleeting shadow that Ryan couldn't quite decipher, but instinctively knew he had caused. The warmth that had suffused the space between them seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden coolness. The abrupt change of subject hung in the air, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious evening. Ryan felt a pang of guilt, sharp and immediate. But the fear still gnawed at him, a relentless beast. He forced a bright, almost manic smile. "Yeah, I'll show you. It's pretty cool. You know, I was thinking—" He kept talking, filling the silence with empty words about chord progressions and lyrical concepts, anything to avoid the truth that had nearly escaped. Leo listened, but the easy warmth had vanished, replaced by a quiet reserve. The connection, so palpable moments before, had become tenuous, stretched thin. After that night, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred. Ryan found himself inventing excuses to leave earlier to circumvent their customary late-night talks. He still borrowed Leo's guitar, still visited, but the spontaneity, the effortless flow of their interactions, had been supplanted by a cautious distance. He felt a constant knot in his stomach, a low thrum of anxiety that accompanied every interaction. He was bewildered by the intensity of his feelings, terrified by their very existence, and increasingly frustrated with himself for his cowardice. The music, once a shared delight, now felt like a conduit for attention he couldn't name, a silent, unspoken chord suspended in the air between them, unresolved and aching. Echoes of silence. An oppressive quiet filled Leo's small apartment, a palpable weight. He sat cross-legged on the worn rug, a cold mug clasped in both hands. His guitar, usually a constant presence, lay dormant in its case. Weeks had passed since Ryan's departure, and with it, the easy cadence of their shared melodies and the hushed conversations that once stretched into dawn. A hollow ache, a loneliness he hadn't foreseen, settled in his chest. He yearned for the sight of Ryan's fingers dancing across the fretboard, the low hum of his voice shaping lyrics, even the faint mingling of cedar and citrus that clung to him. Their music, once so vibrant, now felt like a spectral echo in the unplayed chords. Across town, Ryan leaned against a bar, nursing a drink he barely registered. The woman beside him, her laughter bright and hair impeccably styled, detailed her weekend plans. He nodded, feigning engagement, but his thoughts invariably strayed. He'd endured a succession of these dates, each an attempt to reclaim normalcy, to convince himself he was coping. Yet every encounter felt like a poorly rehearsed play, the conversations superficial, the connections fleeting, the laughter never quite reaching his eyes. He found himself comparing her hand, resting on his arm, to Leo's ink-stained fingers, tracing patterns on a condensation-beaded mug during late-night songwriting sessions. Her passions, though genuinely expressed, only summoned memories of Leo's quiet intensity discussing a new chord progression, the subtle, almost imperceptible warmth that lit his eyes. The guitar he'd borrowed from Leo, perched silently in its stand in his own apartment, served as a persistent, nagging reminder. He pictured Leo, perhaps immersed in a book or humming a nascent tune, and a sharp and unwelcome wave of guilt washed over him. He knew he'd retreated abruptly, leaving a chasm where intimacy had once thrived. One Tuesday afternoon, Aunt Clara discovered Leo gazing out the window, a melancholic haze clouding his eyes. She offered no questions, simply placed a steaming cup of chamomile beside him. "Sometimes quiet can be a gift," she murmured gently. Leo sighed, barely audible. "It's too quiet, Aunt Clara." She settled beside him, her presence a comforting anchor. "Missing a certain kind of sound, are we?" she inquired, the corners of her eyes crinkling. He nodded, a lump tightening in his throat. "The music, the talks, everything." He never named Ryan, but she understood. Aunt Clara possessed a rare intuition for the unsaid. Genuine connections, Leo, aren't always loud. Sometimes they hum beneath the surface, awaiting the opportune moment to resonate again. And sometimes, she paused, her gaze steady, we must grant them space to rediscover their own path. She sipped her tea. A good song, after all, has its quiet passages, doesn't it? Those moments that magnify the power of the crescendo. Her simple words offered a fragile sliver of solace. Leo envisioned a melody, its ebb and flow, its moments of hushed anticipation before a soaring chorus. He hadn't conceived of their bond in such terms before, as something with its own rhythm, its own necessary silences. But the ache persisted. He missed their effortless understanding, the way Ryan could complete his sentences, the shared language of their music. He yearned for the feeling of being truly seen, truly heard. Meanwhile, Ryan found himself driving past Leo's apartment building with increasing frequency. He'd slow, glance up at the familiar window, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. The previous night's date, a charming ukulele player, had offered cheerful tunes, but all he could hear was the intricate, soulful melody he and Leo had left unfinished. A profound frustration welled within him, with himself, with his confusion, with the way his meticulously constructed world felt on the verge of collapse. He longed to reach out, to explain, to apologize, but the words felt too immense, too unwieldy. The silence between them felt like a brick wall erected by his own fear. He knew he had to dismantle it, yet the courage remained stubbornly elusive. The memory of Leo's unguarded vulnerability just before Ryan's retreat burned in his mind. He missed him desperately, more than he ever thought possible. The realization. The city lights smeared into indistinct blurs beyond Ryan's apartment pane, each sparkle a poignant echo of a world that felt increasingly distant. Another obligatory dinner, another polite curve of lips, another laugh utterly devoid of mirth. He'd seen the woman to her door, exchanged a pleasantry about future plans he had no intention of keeping, and then retreated to the cavernous quiet of his own dwelling. The hush, once a cherished refuge, now pressed in like an immense, echoing void. His keys clattered onto the small side table, the sound jarringly loud in the oppressive stillness. He collapsed onto the familiar worn sofa, leaving all but a single corner lamp unlit. Its faint, amber diffusion did little to warm the profound chill that had permeated his very bones. For weeks, he'd pursued a relentless carousel of distractions, a whirlwind of superficial connections and half-hearted attempts to graft himself back onto the trunk of normalcy. But normalcy itself felt alien, a ill-fitting costume he was doomed to parade in. Every exchange felt stilted, every touch bereft of meaning. He found himself perpetually gauging, perpetually yearning for a warmth, a resonant frequency that stubbornly eluded him. His gaze drifted to the vacant corner where Leo's guitar had once leaned. The space now seemed stark, conspicuously hollow, a tangible representation of the chasm within him. He'd rationalized returning the instrument as a necessary severing, a prudent act. Yet with each passing day, the ache in his chest only deepened its grip. He dismissed it as the lingering residue of guilt, as confusion, as a sense of responsibility for a friendship he'd so abruptly sundered. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of yet another forgettable evening, the truth began to prick at the carefully stitched seams of his denial. He closed his eyes. Fragments of recent weeks flickered across his mind's canvas. Leo's soft, unburdened laughter, the graceful dance of his fingers across the fretboard, the intense, focused light in his eyes when their conversations veered into music, the effortless comfort of their shared silences, the fragile vulnerability that had bloomed between them during those late-night sessions. And then, the memory of that strange, almost galvanic sensation whenever Leo was near, a fuzzy effervescence that had spread through him, making his chest feel both expansive and buoyant. He'd labeled it as friendship, as camaraderie, as the intoxicating rush of creative synergy. He'd even actively feared it, interpreting it as something perilous, a threat to the meticulously curated identity he'd always presented to the world. But now, shorn of all pretense, all convenient evasion, the revelation struck him with the impact of a physical blow, that fuzzy warmth, that undeniable pull, the profound, aching desolation that now occupied the space Leo had filled. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't merely friendship. It was something far more profound, far more potent. It was the way his gut had twisted when Leo smiled, the frantic drumbeat of his heart when their hands had accidentally grazed, the way Leo had permeated his thoughts at the most unexpected junctures, a quiet, insistent hum beneath the surface of his daily existence. It was love. The word hung unspoken in the air, yet its presence was undeniable. He opened his eyes, the lamp's gleam suddenly sharper, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. He hadn't been confused. He'd been petrified, terrified of what those feelings signified, terrified of what they would demand of him, terrified of dismantling the comfortable, heteronormative identity he'd worn for so long. He'd fled not from Leo, but from himself, from the inconvenient, undeniable truth that had been quietly unfurling within him. A slow, dawning clarity washed over him, banishing the last vestiges of his self-deception. The fear still coiled in his stomach, a cold, familiar knot, but it was now dwarfed by a fierce, urgent resolve. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep feigning. He had to be brave. He had to confront it, confront Leo, and confront the truth of his own heart. The mere thought of confessing, of laying bare his most vulnerable sentiments, slicked his palms with sweat. But the alternative, a lifetime of hollow smiles and empty spaces, was infinitely more terrifying. He rose, a new purpose squaring his jaw. He had to tell Leo. He absolutely had to. He would quell his fear, silence the insistent doubts, and summon the courage he so desperately needed. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. There was no guarantee of Leo's reaction, or even if he would agree to see him. But Ryan couldn't endure the regret of not trying, of not speaking his truth. The guitar, he realized with sudden insight, wasn't merely an object to be returned. It was a symbol, a fragile bridge, and he had to cross it, no matter how daunting the other side might prove to be. He had to go back to Leo. A new song begins. The silence in Ryan's apartment was a lead blanket, smothering. Since Leo had left, a hollow ache had taken root in his chest, growing with each passing hour. He'd tried to fill the void, tuning his own guitar, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, even attempting a new chord progression. But nothing held his attention. Every melody felt flat. Every thought returned to the way Leo's fingers danced on a fretboard, the soft curve of his smile when a new harmony clicked into place. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now echoed with Leo's absence, a constant reminder of the warmth he'd foolishly pushed away. He paced, a restless energy buzzing beneath his skin. The image of Leo's guitar, propped against his own amplifier, suddenly snapped into focus. It sat there, a silent sentinel, a tangible link to the man who now consumed his every waking moment. He hadn't returned it, not really. Each time he'd brought it to Leo's door, some unspoken plea had kept it in his hands, a flimsy excuse to linger, to absorb more of Leo's quiet brilliance. Now the excuse was gone, replaced by a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Ryan stopped, staring at the instrument. It wasn't just a guitar, it was a conduit, a shared language, the very heart of their blossoming connection. He'd borrowed it, yes, but he'd kept coming back for something far more profound than an instrument. He'd kept coming back for Leo. The realization hit him with the force of a crashing wave, stripping away the layers of denial and self-deception he'd painstakingly constructed over the years. This wasn't just friendship. It was a seismic shift in his world, a reordering of his entire understanding of himself, a new song. The thought blossomed in his mind, tender and fragile, yet undeniably true. This wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the opening bars of something entirely new, a composition he hadn't known he was capable of writing, but to play it, to truly give voice to the melody stirring within him. He had to go back. He had to face the fear, the vulnerability, and the possibility of rejection. The thought sent a tremor through him, but beneath it a current of resolve began to flow. He picked up the guitar, its familiar weight a comfort in his hands. He ran a thumb over the smooth, worn wood, a silent promise forming in his heart. This wasn't just returning a borrowed item. It was a pilgrimage, a declaration. He had to tell Leo, no matter the outcome, he had to lay bare the truth that had been screaming in his soul for weeks, for months, perhaps even longer. The walk to Leo's apartment was a blur of nervous energy. Each step was a battle against the urge to turn back, to retreat into the safe, familiar confines of his old life. But the image of Leo's gentle eyes, the sound of his quiet laughter propelled him forward. He clutched the guitar case tightly, his knuckles white. The city sounds faded, replaced by the pounding of his own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the impending moment. He reached Leo's door, a familiar sight that now felt charged with a new significance. The small L carved into the wood, a detail he'd noticed countless times, seemed to hum with anticipation. He took a deep, shaky breath, the cool evening air stinging his lungs. This was it. No more hiding, no more pretending. He raised his hand, the knock resonating louder than he intended in the quiet hallway. He waited, every muscle tensed, 1,000 unspoken words churning in his mind. What if Leo wasn't home? What if he opened the door and just closed it again? The thought was a cold spike of fear, but he pushed it down. He had to do this for Leo, For himself, the lock clicked and the door swung inward. Leo stood there, his hair a little disheveled, his eyes wide with surprise. He was wearing an old band t-shirt, and for a fleeting moment Ryan's mind registered the comfort of his presence, the quiet warmth that had always drawn him in. Ryan's carefully rehearsed words scattered like dust. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, and the dam holding back his emotions burst. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak, his voice a little hoarse but steady with a newfound conviction. He took another deep breath, letting it fill him, steady him. "I brought your guitar back," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate, yet necessary. He held the instrument out, a peace offering, a symbol of everything they'd built. Then, his gaze locked with Leo's, he added, his voice clearer, stronger. "And I also came back because I love you, Leo." The air crackled with the unspoken, the unsaid, the possibilities that now hung between them, shimmering like a newly struck chord. The guitar, a silent witness, waited for the next note to be played.